So Nicole, you were asking about the pinning. We won't be doing the pinning until we get to that section in the agenda. So probably about 5 minutes after we started, we'll pin it for you,
Okay, that sounds great. Thanks.
just in case you think we're not.
Okay, sounds good.
It's okay. I should probably get on the call.
It's here.
Good afternoon, Campbell. Councillor Campbell, you look fairly relaxed. All ready for this meeting?
I am, I may look relaxed, but I am all psyched up.
Good. So you'll ask all the pertinent questions then?
I sure will.
Okay. So we are live, so I just thought I'd point that out to you too.
Okay.
Mr. Campbell,
Today, how are you?
I'm well. How are you doing?
I'm okay. Today actually has been a better day.
Oh, good.
So it's
Good.
a slowly and surely progression.
Mhm.
And what about your progression? Are you in full rehearsal mode right now?
Do not ask.
Okay.
Yeah, we are in full mode, but I have 90 minutes of dialogue to learn in 6 days.
It's just words. Make them up.
Yeah, I tried that last night. The director was not amused.
It's just do it like you and Mark Russell used to do when you didn't rehearse enough.
True that, my friend. Well, feel better. I hope Shar is spoiling you.
She is, yeah, she's doing everything. Thank,
Ex-
thankfully, I don't know what I'd do without her.
Excellent. Well, I guess I'll shut up now. Looks like the meeting is starting. Take care, my
Yes, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this February 10th Community Safety Standing Policy Committee meeting. I am going to call this meeting to order. Mr. Sarsfield, could we please do a roll call?
Sure. So the members of the Community Safety Standing Policy Committee are, if you could just signify that you're here, Councillor Campbell,
Here,
Councillor Schmidt-Rempel,
Here.
Councillor Parker,
Here.
Councillor Middleton Hope.
Present.
All members of the members of council or members of the committee are in attendance, and we have other members of council also in attendance viewing the process and discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Sarsfield. I will start this meeting with the reconciliation statement. The City of Lethbridge acknowledges that we are gathered on the lands of the Blackfoot people of the Canadian Plains and pays respect to the Blackfoot people, past, present, and future, while recognizing and respecting their cultural heritage, beliefs, and relationship to the land. The City of Lethbridge is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. I trust all members of the committee have had an opportunity to take a look at the agenda. Mr. Sarsfield, do we have any additions to the agenda?
There are none.
Could I have a motion to adopt the agenda, please? From Councillor Campbell, seconded by Councillor. I don't need a seconder. Moved by Councillor Campbell. All in favor? Perfect. Thank you very much. Consent agenda. Could I please, I trust everybody's had an opportunity to take a look at the minutes from January 13th, 2022. Does anyone have any concerns with regards to those minutes? Could I have a motion to approve those minutes, please? Councillor Campbell?
yay.
Do we need a seconder on that one? All in favor? Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank,
And just also say anyone who's online, if you could please mute themselves as well.
we have, our next item is 5.1, presentations from the Palix Foundation, U of L, City of Lethbridge. Read the Palix Foundation Brain Story presentation. Could I have anybody who is online to please mute their mics? And I'd also like to call Mr. Thompson to see if he would like to introduce this presentation.
Thank you, councillors. A foundational principle of the community well-being and safety strategy is achieving individual and family well-being. The same principle is shared by the Palix Foundation, who created and delivers the Alberta Family Wellness Initiative, which includes the Brain Story program. Today's presentation is a condensed version of the online brain certification course, which explores the science of brain development and how our earliest experiences impact our long-term mental and physical health and addiction. Our goal today is to inform City Council, City Administration, and the community of the value of the Alberta Family Wellness Initiative and how it supports achieving community well-being and safety. A leader in completing scientific research for the AFWI has been the University of Lethbridge, and the City of Lethbridge has supported this work by funding application-based programs in Lethbridge that apply the theory in the real world. The community of Lethbridge has also been a leader in supporting the Brain Story program. Lethbridge has the highest per capita number of individuals that have completed the Brain Story certification course. And recently, Lethbridge Police Service has implemented a policy for all staff to complete this course. The Tabor Police Service created an 8-hour course to introduce police cadets to the concepts of trauma-informed policing, using the learning foundations of the Brain Story to inform the training. A formal partnership between the Palix Foundation, the U of L, and the City of Lethbridge is being proposed with the desired outcome of a broader and more effective implementation of the Brain Story program in Lethbridge. I'd like to introduce some key partners in today's presentation. Nancy Mannix. Nancy Mannix is the chair and patron of the Palix Foundation, a private foundation whose philanthropy aims to and ultimately support improved health and wellness outcomes for all children and families. The work Nancy has done with the Palix Foundation has garnered some prestigious awards, such as the 2015 Canadian Medical Award for Excellence in Health Promotion, the 2014 Lieutenant Governor of Alberta's Circle on Mental Health and Addiction True Leadership Award, the 2013 Certificate Recognition by the Canadian Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, 2010-2011 President's Award for the Canadian Mental Health Association, and in 2006 Medal for Exceptional Contribution for Early Childhood Development by the Centre of Excellence for Early Childhood Development. Nancy has served as a member of the Alberta Advocates Health Solutions Board for her long career and highly regarded work in the charitable sector, has included a number of organizations such as the Calgary Health Trust, the Calgary West Foundation. She has also served on numerous boards, including the Alberta Heritage Foundation for Medical Research and the Alberta Bone and Joint Health Institute. Nancy has a bachelor's degree from the University of San Diego and a Juris Doctor degree from Seattle University. Dr. Nicole Sharon, another one of our presenters, has a PhD in neuroscience and moved to Alberta in 2003 to hold an Alberta Heritage Foundation for Medical Research Neuroscience Canada Research Fellowship at the University of Lethbridge. Her research expertise includes experience-based brain development, neurodevelopment disorders, and brain plasticity. Nicole left academia in 2007 to focus on mobilizing this knowledge into public policy and professional practice. Over the last decade, she has provided professional development, consultation and coaching to professionals in education, healthcare, justice, and the nonprofit sector to help them apply this science in their own settings. She is the former scientific director of the Palix Foundation and continues to collaborate with Palix as a trusted representative. Dr. Serena Jenkins has a PhD in behavioral neuroscience from the University of Lethbridge. Her work examined how positive and negative maternal experiences prior to pregnancy impact brain development in the next generation. She is currently the scientific associate with the Palix Foundation, a sessional instructor at the U of L, and a research associate on a project that is developing an intervention project for babies who were deprived of oxygen during delivery at the Alberta Children's Hospital Neonatal Intensive Care Unit. And with us today is Dr. Brian Kolb, a native of Calgary. Brian did his PhD at Penn State University and postdoctoral work at the University of Western Ontario and the Montreal Neurological Institute. He is currently a professor of neuroscience at the University of Lethbridge, where he has been there since 1976. His current research examines how perinatal factors modify the development of the cerebral cortex and how this is related to behavior in laboratory animals and children. Kolb is the author of, or co-author of 7 books, including Fundamentals of Human Neuropsychology, now in its 8th edition, and Introduction to Brain and Behavior, now in its 7th edition, and about 450 papers and chapters. According to the Google Scholar, his H factor is 101, with over 45,000 citations. He is past president of the Canadian Society for Brain Behavior and Cognitive Science and of the Experimental Division of the Canadian Psychological Association. He has received Lifetime Achievement Awards from the Canadian Society for Brain Behavior and Cognitive Science and the International Neuropsychology Society. He is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and is currently a member of the Child Brain Development Program of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. He is a recipient of 4 honorary degrees, and in 2017 he was named the Officer of the Order of Canada. Also joining us today are Dr. Graham Abella, who is the Chief of Police for Taber Police Service, and I believe Chief Shaheen Medezadeh is also online with us today. And in addition to that, we've got Bruce Holstead, who is the Executive Director for the Fresh Start Recovery Center in Calgary and Lethbridge. And on that note, I'm going to turn the presentation over to our friends at Palix.
Thank you.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. There we go. So what we're going to talk about this afternoon and have some question and answer about as well is really what we now know about the science of resilience, or our capacity to cope with the challenges that we experience day to day in our lives. But before doing that, I'll give you a little bit of background again about why we're here. Next slide. So the Palix Foundation, as mentioned, is a private foundation working in Alberta in the related areas of child development, addiction, and mental health. It has offices in Calgary, Alberta, and they have an endowment of about $130 million. And over the past 10 years or so, the foundation has invested $90 million into this work of mobilizing this key foundational knowledge across Alberta, across Canada, and in other jurisdictions globally. Next slide. In 2007, the foundation created a funded platform of work called the Alberta Family Wellness Initiative. And it was really grounded in 3 core neuroscience concepts that help us understand the capacity for resilience that gets built over time. The first concept is that the experiences that we have, particularly in development, in the environments in which we grow up in, actually shape developing brain circuits in key ways that can set us on life course trajectories, either for good or for ill. The foundation is particularly interested in addiction as an outcome of that early developmental period. And the key here is that addiction, we now know, is a chronic disease of the brain. It is not outside of the body, it's actually inside the body. And that means that addiction can potentially be to more than drugs, alcohol, and gambling. It can involve other human pursuits like food, like work, like sex, and like the internet. And the last concept is that the brain retains its capacity to change over the course of the lifespan. So even though, yes, during the developmental period, the brain is most sensitive to change in response to the environment, we retain that capacity. And that means that there is hope at any age or stage across the lifespan to be able to provide the right interventions and supports that can help shore up skill sets, change that brain, and lead to better outcomes. Next slide. So the vision of the PALEX Foundation and the Alberta Family Wellness Initiative is to really be a catalyst for concrete action and change across all different sectors in how we understand what we do, not just in childhood, but also for families and for individuals, no matter where they find themselves. And over the course of this work, the PALEX Foundation has employed a number of experts. Next slide. To help guide their programming, and they've also engaged with this group to provide an oversight curriculum committee for the Brain Story certification course, which was mentioned at the beginning of the meeting. And so in this group are Judy Cameron, who's a member of the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child, George Koob, who is the director of the NIAAA for the National Institutes of Health in the US, Tom McClellan, who was the former deputy drug czar for the White House under President Obama, and also was an editor on a recent Surgeon General's report on addiction. Christine Chambers, who's the scientific director for the Institute of Human Development, Child and Youth Health for CIHR. Shu Lee, who is the former director of that institute. Tony Phillips, who is the former director of the Institute of Neurosciences, Mental Health and Addiction for CIHR. David Dodge, who you probably know is the former governor of the Bank of Canada. And the late Glenda McQueen, who was the vice dean for the Cummings School of Medicine at the University of Calgary. Next slide. So what we're really going to focus on today is something that has been termed the core story of brain development. So how the experiences that we have in development, how they shape developing brain circuitry over time. But the genesis of this really comes from some work that happened almost 20 years ago. Next slide. So it stemmed from a group called the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child. So this is a network of some of the top researchers in their respective fields, from behavioral and developmental neuroscience, genetics, molecular biology, child psychology, pediatrics, and they were able to get in front of multiple audiences who were not research-based audiences to talk about the importance of this research for public policy. But what they realized was, even though people were expressing interest in the information, saying that it was relevant, it wasn't actually getting translated into practice. And so what they ended up doing was partnering, next slide, with an organization called the Frameworks Institute. So Frameworks is a nonprofit communications think tank located in Washington, D.C. And they're made up of, again, a network of social psychologists, cognitive psychologists, medical anthropologists, linguists, who really concentrate on helping translate an expert story for the general public. And so what Frameworks does is they work with the experts to ask, okay, what is it that the general public really needs to know about what you're trying to get across? Then they go out to the general public and they map the public's belief systems about those particular issues. And then they look at the gaps between the expert view and the public view. And what they do is they then create concrete mechanistic metaphors that explain more complicated concepts, and they test them with the general public to see whether or not the public can understand these, relate to them, and whether or not it closes the gap between public understanding and expert understanding of a particular issue. Next slide. And so based on that work, the National Scientific Council, in partnership with Frameworks, created a suite of working papers that explained key scientific concepts and why they are relevant for public policy. And what they were able to do then, using this translated scientific story, is say to those policy members or to those policymakers, if you use this toolkit, essentially this communications translated story toolkit, to explain to the public why these policies are important, they will understand what you're trying to do and they'll support it. Next slide. So just how does the public understand developmental outcomes and resilience? Well, the PALAX Foundation wanted to know, since the original work was done in the US, whether or not there were similar gaps in the Alberta understanding of issues such as child development, children's mental health, addiction. So they brought frameworks to Alberta to do some on-the-street testing around how Albertans understand these particular issues. Next slide. And what they found is concepts that were very, very similar to the concepts that were unearthed in the US. So what the public thinks matters between a good outcome and a bad outcome for a child are really parents. So it's parental behavior that explains all of those individual differences. No challenge is too great for any of us to overcome. And effort is really about why we see individual difference. Some people try very hard. And of course, if you try, you always succeed. Resilience is yours if you want it. Everyone is born with it, but we do have to choose it to use it. And positive outcomes for children were considered to be the norm. And they really revolved around whether or not children were able to follow directions, whether they could do well in school, whether or not they have confidence. Negative outcomes were seen, generally speaking, as the exception, and they were driven by things like proper nutrition, whether or not you have access to healthy foods, or safety, whether or not we have kids wearing seatbelts and bike helmets. Next slide. And so what really comes out of some of these themes is that the difference between a child who turns out well and one who doesn't is all about the parents, the family, and whether or not potentially it's a single parent family or whether or not there's a dad. How people explain why some children who experience adversity actually do okay. Well, it's all about optimism, determination, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, personal choice, hard work, that sort of thing. When asked how to explain how genetics and environment determine child outcomes, people really don't understand that those two things are entwined. It's not nature versus nurture, it's actually nature and nurture. So they talk about, that children grow into who they are naturally, or they're just lucky and have good genes. And when they talk about what it means for a child to be resilient and be able to cope with the things they have in their lives, well, again, it's about willpower, effort, believing in yourself and standing up for yourself. Next slide. And so in order to get around those public belief systems that don't actually mesh with the expert understanding of how resilience works, again, the Frameworks Institute had created these mechanistic metaphors that they put together into a narrative or a story that would explain what is it that we're trying to do, how does it work? And so those metaphors are really brain architecture. So brains are built over time and they're built from the bottom up. We need a strong foundation of basic skills and abilities that are supported by basic neural circuitry, because that's going to support all the more complex neural circuitry that builds on top. Again, just in the way that you want your house to have a strong foundation so you don't end up with a crack in the roof. How does it work? Well, one of the key ingredients is what we call serve and return style social interactions. So these are responsive interactions between a child and an adult. And it looks like kind of like a game, like a ball being passed back and forth, back and forth. What this does is it gives children the opportunity to practice pro-social skills and abilities that help to strengthen the underlying neural circuitry in their brains. What are some of the most important skills and abilities and systems that we want to ensure develop well? Well, one of them is the air traffic control system, what we call the air traffic control system in the brain, which is really about executive function and self-regulation. So it's our ability to plan, prioritize, pay attention, follow lots of rules, and be able to regulate our emotions and ensure that they're appropriate for the situation at hand. Another key skill, another key system is the reward and motivation system. This is the system that allows us to find normal everyday experiences like those social interactions rewarding. It also gets tuned based on experience. And if that system gets out of tune because of experience, we might need to seek out even more highly rewarding experiences, potentially like drugs, like alcohol, like food, like sex, in order to bring that dial up and help us feel normal. What is the key experience that undermines healthy brain development? Well, it's called toxic stress. So this is a chronic, often unpredictable amount of stress that happens. Stress hormones go high. They remain high for long periods of time. The key here is that that kind of stress isn't buffered by supportive adult relationships, and it's that prolonged activation of the stress response system and those stress hormones that undermine brain development over time. And all of these things come together in our capacity for resilience, or how we cope on a daily basis with the challenges that we encounter. Next slide. So now let's talk a little bit more about resilience and unpack that for you. So resilience is both a positive outcome in the face of challenging experiences, as well as a dynamic capacity and skill that can be built over time. And so it's often useful to think about resilience as being kind of like a scale, like you see here on the screen, with a positive arm on the left-hand side, a negative arm on the right-hand side. And we can think about those positive experiences, positive supports, as being kind of like boxes or weights. And for the purposes of this image, think about them as green boxes, positive weights that will come down and weigh down on that positive arm. But we also know that we all experience adversity at some point in our lives. We can think about that as being kind of like red boxes or weights that pile up on the left-hand side of the scale. A resilient outcome means that the scale always tips in the positive direction, even if there's weight on the negative side. But when we think about resilience as a capacity that can be built, it's more about how we ensure that that scale tips to the positive all of the time. And there are a few key ways that we can do this. We can try and load up that positive arm with all sorts of green boxes that will weigh it down. We can try and prevent as much as possible those red boxes or weights that are piling up on the other side. But the other key piece of this scale that influences how easy it is to tip to one side or the other is the fulcrum, or the tipping point. And that's really that purple triangle that you see at the bottom of the scale. And as you can see, it's got a little DNA helix embedded in it. This is really about, represents our sort of biological capacity for resilience that we're all born with. So that tipping point or fulcrum starts in a different place for every child, a different place for every individual. But what we now know from this newer science is that our biology is not our fate. It's actually influenced by the experiences that we have and the environments that we grow up in, both positive and negative. And that means that we can shift that fulcrum either to the left to privilege the positive side of the scale, make it easier for that scale to tip positive, or potentially to the right, privilege the negative side of that scale and make it easier for the scale to tip in the negative direction. Next slide. So now what I want to do is unpack for you a little bit more carefully those three aspects of the resilience scale and how they work. And the first aspect that I'm going to talk about is the fulcrum. And so this is really about the skills and abilities and the neural circuits and biology that support the development of those skills and abilities and how they will influence our capacity for resilience over time. And those are those serve and return style social interactions, the executive function self-regulation system that acts like an air traffic control system in the brain, and the reward and motivation systems. Next slide. And so now we'll play a couple of short clips from Tom Boyce and Pat Levitt talking about how our genes play a role in setting that fulcrum. Next slide.
In the case of most human traits and most human diseases and disorders, they come from not just genetics and not just from environmental experience, but from this kind of convergence of the two, the mixing of the two into what's called an epigenetic process. And that is the process by which human experience actually changes not the sequence of the DNA itself, but the expression of the genes, the differential expression, which turns out to be what really does guide our fate and our ability and our potential as human beings.
How it is that these experiences can last so long and have such pervasive impact on all these different aspects, whether it's addiction for drugs, gambling, sex, effects on our ability to emotionally regulate anxiety and depression, mental illness risk. And these experiences essentially put signatures, what I call kind of penciled signatures, onto the genes that we inherit. That's how experience impacts our genes that we inherit from mom or dad. So while the genes that we inherit might be causing risk for a particular disorder, it's not inevitable. The experiences add the signature onto the DNA, which essentially allows certain genes to be turned on or certain genes to be turned off. That, in the end, when it happens during critical periods of development, will end up changing the architecture of the brain for a lifetime.
Okay, next slide. So the next piece we'll talk about is the serve and return style social interactions. And these social interactions play two really important roles. Not only are they a key skill that we need to have as a solid foundation for our own mental health so that we can interact with others, be able to access that social support that we need in order to maintain stable mental health across the lifespan. They're also the key ingredient in building this in our children. So we also want to ensure that parents have a solid set of serve and return skills so they can in turn build this in their child. Next slide. So this is a short video from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child that explains how that works. Next slide.
The key to forming strong brain architecture is what's known as serve and return interaction with adults. In this developmental game, new neural connections form in the brain as young children instinctively serve through babbling, facial expressions, and gestures. And adults return the serve, responding in a very directed, meaningful way. It starts very early in life, when a baby coos and the adult interacts and directs the baby's attention to a face or hand. This interaction forms the foundation of brain architecture upon which all future development will be built. It helps create neural connections between all the different areas of the brain, building the emotional and cognitive skills children need in life.
Okay, next slide. And here what we have is a shorter version that explains this in a more engaging way for a public audience. Next slide.
So just how is a solid brain foundation built and maintained in a developing child? One way is through what brain experts call serve and return interactions. Imagine a tennis match between a caregiver and a child, but instead of hitting a ball back and forth across a net, various forms of communication pass between the two. From eye contact to touch, from singing to simple games like peekaboo. These interactions repeated throughout a young person's developing years are the bricks that build a healthy foundation for all future development.
Great. Next slide. So now I want to show you a short clip of Serve and Return in Action. So this is a video from a Parent Link Center just outside of Edmonton. They work with families right across all sort of levels and abilities. This is a young mom who's had some intergenerational challenges, but what they've been doing is explaining this science to her, and here's how she now understands the importance of serve and return interactions. Next slide.
With the serve and return, it's a big thing to just be there and communicate with each coo, and my little guy looks for it now. He just learned how to clap, so he'll clap a few times, stop, look at me, wait for me to make a big deal about it and start clapping, and then he'll continue to clap.
Okay, next slide. So now we're going to talk about the executive function and self-regulation skills, again, that they act kind of like an air traffic control system in the brain. Next slide. And here's a short video to unpack that a little bit more for you. Next slide.
Ever wonder why some children are well organized and have an easier time adapting to change than others? It's a result of how certain skills develop in our brains at a young age. Scientists call these skills executive function and self-regulation, which can be thought of like air traffic control in the child's mental airspace. Think of a young child's brain as the control tower at a busy airport. All those planes landing and taking off, and all of the support systems on the ground simultaneously demand the controller's attention to avoid a crash. It's the same with a young child learning to pay attention, plan ahead, cope with frustration, and follow lots of rules.
When executive functioning skills are working well, they're invisible. It's not like you see them in action because they enable children to be a good student, to be a good friend, to learn well. So they're just kind of hidden. It's really when they break down or when a child is really challenged by these capacities, hasn't had a chance to develop them very well, that you see problems.
Kids with well-developed executive function can deal with day-to-day worries, temptations, and obligations that pile up in their minds. They have the skills to regulate the flow of information and prioritize tasks. Executive function is one of the ways we manage stress and maintain an even keel, even as demands on our attention start to pile up. Kids who haven't developed strong executive function have a harder time directing mental traffic. Without the ability to prioritize, thoughts pile up and collisions occur, leading to frustration and anxiety.
First of all, we aren't born with executive functioning skills. Executive functioning skills are capacities that we learn. It's very important that children be in relatively predictable, unchaotic environments that are free of toxic stress, because when we are surrounded by chaos and disorganization, and especially if we're surrounded by fear and anxiety and a world that feels threatening, it's very hard for children to acquire these kinds of capacities.
Like most skills, good executive function depends on a strong brain foundation that develops in our earliest years of life. Caregivers can help by setting a good example with their own behavior, practicing serve and return interactions, and preventing toxic stress. As kids grow up through their preschool years and even into their teens, a stable, predictable environment will help them develop good executive function skills.
Executive functioning skills can be trained and taught. You do not have to give up on a child who has these problems. There are very sensitive periods during the ages from about 2 to 5 or 6, and again during adolescence, when these skills seem to be kind of growing by leaps and bounds. So you have a couple of opportunities, and ideally do both.
The human brain is an amazing thing. With practice, it can learn to pay attention, plan ahead, prioritize, and react to events as they unfold, just like the air traffic control tower at our busy airport. With help from the community, kids can learn the skills they need to thrive in a challenging world.
So not only are those skills highly critical during childhood in terms of helping children to succeed when they're in school or with their friends. They're also key predictors of our success in adulthood, success in the workforce, success in our own relationships, and the success that we have parenting our children. Next slide. Okay, so the last system that I'll bring up here is the reward and motivation system. This system also gets tuned in development, and you can think about how it works as being kind of like a dial that can be tipped down to sort of no motivation all the way up to raring to go. And what we ideally want to do is have that dial sort of pointing somewhere in the middle, particularly when we are engaging with those social interactions that, of course, we are supposed to be finding rewarding. But when we experience a lot of toxic stress, that depresses this system. And if it occurs for long periods of time, what can happen is this system can get tuned in such a way that that dial points actually more towards the empty phase. And that means that we might potentially need to, again, reach out to even more rewarding types of behaviors like drugs, like alcohol, like other kinds of behaviors, in order to turn that dial up just to make us feel normal. So this is another key system that gets set early in the developmental period and is responsive to experiences. Next slide. So now we're going to talk about the negative arm on that scale, the left-hand side, those red boxes that pile up over time. Next slide. And this is often referred to as adversity. But of course, within the research literature, we also talk about stress. But it turns out that not all stress is the same when it comes to the influence on the developing brain. So there are three major types of stress, and they all have a different impact. Next slide. And now I'll play you a short clip that will talk about those three different types of stress and how they influence key systems over time. Next slide.
Research has proven that positive experiences in our earliest years actually help build brain architecture. So does that mean negative experiences can weaken brain architecture? The answer is yes, and the culprit is certain kinds of stress. The body and brain respond to stress by raising the heartbeat, pumping out adrenaline, and sending out stress hormones like cortisol, preparing us to act in a crisis. One kind of stress, called positive stress, is beneficial. It's normal and healthy for children to face challenges like meeting new people or attending the first day of school. The stress responses triggered by these events are usually short and not too severe. This kind of stress is positive because it prepares the brain and body for stressful situations later in life.
There are kind of these multiple phases of stress. So we have kind of what we call good stress, which is this kind of controllable stress in our lives, things like studying for a test, solving a problem. At the time we may not like them, but the reality of it is that we grow from them, we develop adaptive coping skills, and they kind of benefit us in the long run.
Children surrounded by caring adults experience positive stress in ways that benefit and strengthen their brain architecture. It's how we prepare our brains and bodies for other stressful events that we will experience throughout life. Sometimes children face more serious events. Think of a bad accident or a tragedy like a death in the family or a natural disaster. These events can cause a more severe stress response with the potential to last a long time and come back often. Support from caregivers can buffer the severity of the stress response and help keep stress levels under control. If the stress is kept in check, it won't do lasting damage to the child's brain and body. That's called tolerable stress.
And so this is things that are bad, but they're the kind of things we can't avoid, like the death of our parents or moving away from home, things that everyone goes through. And they're not positive, they're kind of negative in value, but they're the kind of things that everyone goes through. We can all kind of support each other, and they're made a lot easier by support networks. And coping skills and stuff like that.
The attention and support of caregivers prevents tolerable stress from causing lasting harm to developing brains. A third kind of stress is called toxic stress. It occurs during repeated exposure to bad situations like abuse, neglect, or serious hardship. If no supportive adults are around to help buffer the stress response, the hormone levels stay dangerously high. Severe stress is especially toxic if it occurs often and lingers for a long time. That can have a negative impact on brain architecture and on other systems in the body. Toxic stress can cause serious health problems later in life.
These are things that are like pervasive, typically very uncontrollable and unpredictable. Abusive relationships, poverty, loss of job, loss of social status, things like this, which are kind of beyond our control and are very pervasive in our life and really kind of have this detrimental effect on us.
Toxic stress can weaken developing brain architecture and damage other body systems in young children. The effects can be a lifetime of health challenges, including physical and mental health problems, and even addiction. To ensure a healthier future for our families and communities, we need to work together to support caregivers and children, prevent toxic stress, and provide the kinds of nurturing experiences that build healthy brains and bodies.
Okay, next slide. And now I'll play a short clip again from Pat Levitt, who'll talk a little bit about some of those longer term outcomes in terms of exposure to toxic stress and how this potentially influences our reward and motivation systems. Next slide.
During development, those are the parts of the brain that get set up early. Those are the parts of the brain that are particularly sensitive to adverse experiences like toxic stress, abuse, neglect, poor caregiving, all sorts of things that can contribute to those parts of the brain, those parts of brain architecture that are not formed properly. So what happens later? Well, if those parts of the brain that are controlling our desires, our ability to control our emotions are not formed properly, then later on what we do is we try to seek out, maybe over-seek out, those kinds of things in the environment that can make us feel better, like drugs, like alcohol, like other addictive behaviors.
Okay, next slide. So that brings us to adverse childhood experiences, which you heard referenced in the previous video. Adverse childhood experiences are experiences that we have, generally speaking, before the age of 18 that cause toxic stress. The term was coined through the original Adverse Childhood Experiences study, which went on in California. It was a partnership between Kaiser Permanente, an HMO in California, and the Centers for Disease Control. Next slide. What they did was they asked 17,000 middle class, middle-aged, mostly Caucasian, generally speaking, non-vulnerable folks, all with health insurance, a 10-item questionnaire. Before the age of 18, did you ever experience, and it was 5 types of childhood maltreatment and 5 types of family dysfunction. And you can see the questionnaire here. Now, what I do want to point out is these particular experiences, or ACEs, are generally speaking the best studied types of ACEs in terms of their long-term impacts on our later health. But they're not necessarily the only types of ACEs that children can experience. So things like chronic bullying, systemic discrimination, racism can also potentially cause toxic stress and be an ACE for a child. But what the PALEX Foundation did a few years ago was they went to a large population here in Calgary of over 4,000 individuals to ask them the ACE questionnaire to see if we could understand the burden of ACEs in the Alberta population. Next slide. And this short video summarizes some of those results. Next slide.
Most people know that genes and behaviors play a big role in our health and wellness. But another factor has a huge influence on our lifelong health, and that's brain development. The experiences we have growing up change our brain architecture in ways that affect our mental and physical health. Positive experiences build strong, resilient brains. Negative experiences, in the absence of supportive relationships, can derail our brain development, leading to ongoing challenges. Scientists call these adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. Things like abuse, neglect, and growing up in a home with addictions or mental illness can cause toxic stress, which affects a child's brain and body. When families have the right kinds of supports, they can prevent adverse experiences from causing toxic stress, leading to better health across the lifespan. And because brains can change, it's possible to get brain development back on track, even where toxic stress has occurred. Thanks to the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, scientists are able to show the relationship between ACEs and a number of health outcomes that lead to increased use of the healthcare system, from diabetes and heart disease to addiction and other mental illnesses. The original ACEs study was conducted by physician and researcher Dr. Vincent Felitti, who was chief of Kaiser Permanente's Department of Preventative Medicine. He explains how shortcomings in conventional medicine inspired him to conduct the study. To demonstrate the connection between ACEs and health outcomes, Dr. Felitti developed a series of questions called the ACE Questionnaire. It asks participants if they grew up in a home with mental illness, physical abuse, substance misuse, and a range of other questions about childhood adversity. Each time a person answers yes to a question, their ACE score increases by 1. In Alberta, we conducted the ACE questionnaire with 4,000 primary care patients to see if ACEs were having an effect in our province. Researchers compared participants' ACE scores with a number of health outcomes and found a very strong relationship. For example, having 3 or more ACEs significantly increases the risk of diabetes compared to those with no ACEs. The study showed a similar result for respiratory conditions, gastrointestinal disorders, anxiety, addiction, and a number of other illnesses. This doesn't mean that a person with a high ACE score will necessarily get sick, but it does show that across the province, ACEs increase our risk of illness and put pressure on our healthcare system. Armed with this research and an understanding of the science of brain development, Alberta is moving forward with a strategy to improve the way we support families. We have the knowledge and tools to reduce adverse experiences in children and adolescent lives. And we've come a long way in understanding outcomes in adults who have experienced ACEs and are living with illness. We know that it's never too late to add positive supports and lighten the burden of past experiences so that people can become more resilient. Visit albertafamilywellness.org and get Brain Stories certified.
And so just so you know, the population that was surveyed here in Calgary was a similar population, not a vulnerable population, generally speaking, high income, high education, but still fully 2/3 of the sample endorsed at least one ACE in their history. So next slide. I'm not seeing the slides anymore. There we go. All right, so the last aspect of the scale that we'll unpack now are the positive supports. So again, those supportive, responsive relationships, the serve and return that we know is critical to building healthy brain architecture, as well as the safe, stable, and supportive environments. So where can you go to have opportunities to skill build, opportunities to decompress? And what I'll do now is play you a short video that brings together these positive supportive relationships and environments with the negative experiences and the fulcrum in terms of how that produces resilience over time. Next slide. Okay, and next slide.
Brains. They are everywhere. In the world's gentlest places and its harshest. In this unforgiving environment, some brains exhibit troubling signs. Addiction, illness, depression, social disorder. Yet others thrive. Why have some brains developed the ability to cope in harsh conditions while others struggle? It is one of nature's great secrets.
Hi. Hello? This is amazing. But I just need to clarify a few things. This great secret? It's actually science. Severe adversity isn't good for any brain. But it is true that some brains do better than others in the face of significant challenges.
Oh, a scientist. Yes, I agree. This is a great secret of science.
Great, yes, but not a secret. Let me explain. We're born with brains, but our brains change as we grow. They develop based on experiences we have, and different brains respond to experiences in different ways. Okay, thanks. I'll let you get back to it.
Indeed. Some brains show robustity and strongitude, while others...
Sorry, can I just... We scientists use the word resilience. Some brains are more resilient than others.
Yes, resiliensis.
Resilience?
Resilience. Revenge of the cortex.
Resilience is a result of the interplay between genes and life experiences. It's a brain's ability to maintain good functioning under adversity.
Resilience makes us invincible.
Nothing makes us invincible. What resilience does is to give less leverage to negative factors in our lives and tip the balance in favor of positive outcomes.
Resilience. Fate's legendary prize.
Whoa, no! Some people are born with more resilience than others, but resilience can also be built over time. It's a big project involving parents, caregivers, teachers,
kith, kin, karaoke comrades,
soccer coaches, counselors,
pastry chefs, associate producers, even millennials, like a barn raising in times of old.
Yeah. In fact, we scientists believe strong brain architecture is the foundation for resilience. And, oh, look over there.
Oh, yes. A young brain returns after months of isolation and adversity. No words can describe what this poor brain has suffered.
There are words that describe it. We scientists call it toxic stress.
Toxic stress lies in wait.
No, that's not, no. Stress happens inside the body. It's the fight or flight system kicking in. But if stress hormones are elevated too high and for too long, it can have negative effects on the brain and body.
Stress, a nasty poison.
Not all stress, just toxic stress. With the right supports, we can make severe stress tolerable, which means it won't do lasting damage. Stress can even be positive because it helps us to learn problem solving and coping skills, which leads us back to resilience.
Alas, this brain is resilience-less.
No, it isn't. Let me explain. Remember when I talked about giving less leverage to negative experiences and tipping the scale in a positive direction? Well, here's a little something I've been working on. It's a really amazing metaphor. Here goes. I call it the resilience scale.
Resilience scales. Protective armor plates that
shiny. But no. The resilience scale helps us understand why some brains are more resilient than others.
The resilience scale sends out invisible resilience rays that's
really just a scale. See? It's a beam being held up by a fulcrum.
Full of crumbs?
Geez, no! A fulcrum. You know, like high school Never mind. Let me just clean this up. See, negative experiences add weight to one end of the beam, and positive factors add weight to the other end. Ideally, we want the scale to tip toward the positive side and lead towards positive life outcomes.
The brain's future literally hangs in the balance.
The position of the fulcrum can be understood as our original capacity for resilience. It's something like our genetic starting position. Remember the young brain that was struggling to survive? Look, it started life with the fulcrum off-center, giving more leverage to negative experiences. Serious stuff, like abuse, neglect, and chaotic environments. That means positive factors like responsive relationships, safe environments, and learning opportunities had less leverage. Over time, the negative load shifted the fulcrum even farther in a negative direction.
Tragedy.
Not at all. Right now, this brain is experiencing poor health. But with help, the scale can be tipped toward more positive outcomes. The first thing we can do is to stop negative experiences from stacking up. Then, we can add more positive factors, loading up the positive side of the scale. And we're not done. We can work to shift the fulcrum in a way that favors positive outcomes.
The fulcrum, an amazing instant fix-it button.
No, it's a process. It involves many supportive people and plenty of time. Remember? This brain is still young, so adult brains can work with it to relieve toxic stress and teach coping skills. In early childhood, these efforts can push the fulcrum a considerable distance.
Childhood, filled with fascination and fulcrum flexibility.
Sort of, but there are other sensitive developmental periods that are windows of opportunity, like adolescence. And even if this brain doesn't get help until adulthood, change is still possible. It will take more support, and the change will be less dramatic. But any fulcrum can be moved to make positive outcomes more achievable.
The bad experiences disappear.
I'm afraid not. It's hard to undo the effects of past negative experiences, and it takes time. But we can eventually relieve the burden of those negative experiences. Our little brain can get the help it needs to adapt, recover, and enjoy good health and wellness.
And everyone, everywhere can become more resilient for eternity.
Why not? With the right support, everyone everywhere can become more resilient.
I'm so glad I saved humanity. It's been a majestic experience.
Yeah, me too. Well done.
I muted myself there. I was going to apologize. There is actually a great soundtrack with all sorts of sound effects built into that video. I couldn't hear them. I'm not sure if anyone else could, but the dialogue came through, which was the important piece. Next slide. And so a few years ago, the Harvard Center on the Developing Child published a key paper that focused on essentially the three core principles that we've just been talking about, and how important they are to prevent the intergenerational transmission of poor outcomes. And of course, it's that supporting responsive relationships, reducing sources of toxic stress, strengthening those core life skills. And the intergenerational aspect of this is not only do we need to build these for children today, we need to ensure that the parents of today have those core life skills nice and strong and foundational, because they're the key ones who build it in their children. Next slide. But again, these three core intergenerational concepts also map perfectly onto the resilience scale. You know, that positive arm is those serve and return interactions that support healthy development. The fulcrum really represents those core life skills, or those skills and abilities that allow us to navigate through complex environments, cope with challenge. And again, the idea of reducing the sources of toxic stress that will weigh down the other side of the scale. Next slide. And so lastly here is a short video clip from Linda Mays. She has developed and piloted a number of different programs, intervention programs for parents with addictions, and particularly for new parents. And so she'll talk a little bit about how addiction influences the intergenerational transmission of outcomes for young children. Next slide.
And the reason that's important is that when we think about an addictive process, it's one of the outcomes, again, of early toxic stress. That we turn to habitually rewarding things as a way of dealing with our stress. And early toxic stress conveys a kind of dysregulation of our stress reactions, so that even minor things in life become more stressful. And we then try to turn to things that are more rewarding to try and take care of that stress. So that's one issue. And the other issue then about if one thinks in that way, then the question is then how does an addicted adult who becomes a parent, how do they experience their infant? And their infant becomes a stressor as well. Their baby's cry may be stressful, not knowing what the baby needs or feels may be stressful, which then leads them to turn back to drugs or whatever they have found that habitually works to take care of that stress.
Next slide. So now we're going to provide a real-time application of how harnessing all of these concepts can work when we're talking specifically about addiction. But before I do that, next slide, I'm going to cue up a little video here from George Koob, who's going to talk about the key systems that are dysregulated in addiction. Next slide.
There are really three key elements of addiction for me. So one is that your reward system doesn't work, your stress system works too much, and your executive function system is impaired. Addiction is a brain disease, and it ultimately ends up with changing how your brain works.
Next slide. So before we play this clip, I want you to keep in mind those key systems that George Koob just talked about, as well as thinking about, those serve and return interactions, how they work to support us. Again, the air traffic control system, executive function, the reward and motivation systems, and how it plays out in this video. Next slide.
In the very back seat of the number 12 bus, only Jeremy's eyes were moving as he scanned the shadows outside, his forehead pressed up against the glass. He had missed his stop. It was 1:30 in the morning, and when the bus had approached his street, he had imagined lifting his arm up to pull the cord. He had imagined himself walking up the stairs to his crappy little apartment. He had imagined himself flop into his grubby, sunken couch and pull his tiny TV close enough to watch. But he hadn't pulled the cord. He was motionless, with a tiny spark of excitement and a tiny spark of nausea circling like flies in his stomach. The park 10 minutes ahead, on the number 12 line, is where he used to score. He could feel it getting closer, though he couldn't see it. He had no intention of getting off the bus at the park. He just wanted to drift by and catch a glimpse. He was shaken out of his trance when his cell phone went off. He recognized the ringtone right away. HS. Jeremy always responded when the HS alert went off. He didn't want to miss out on an easy $10 which his counselor would give him for each week he didn't miss a response. HS was an app on his phone that his counselor, Brenda, had set up for him during his last week of inpatient treatment. Brenda had tailored HS to Jeremy's specific needs by asking him a series of questions about where and when he used to use and what his triggers were. HS knew that Jeremy was a night owl, and oftentimes the application would check in with him at night to see how he was doing, and sometimes suggest he listen to some guided relaxation, or maybe suggest a meeting for him to attend the next day, if he hadn't been to one in a while. Jeremy had already received a check-in from HS at 11, but now his phone was vibrating because the system had detected that he was near one of his high-risk locations. After Jeremy answered a few brief questions about how he was feeling, HS presented Jeremy with some suggestions based on his answers. The system had determined that it was important that Jeremy have a video call with an on-call counselor right away. Jeremy didn't think that was necessary, but when he tapped on the ignore button, HS played a video of himself talking about his life prior to treatment. Jeremy sat back in his seat and thought about it for a minute. I cannot afford to be that guy again, he thought. He reconsidered and tapped on connect. Jeremy looked around. The bus had passed the park, and he was heading back west. I'm the only one in here, he thought. This shouldn't be so bad. He sat up a little straighter and positioned the phone in front of him. Within a minute, he was talking face to face with his counselor, Brenda.
So what you can see in this example is a technological intervention that harnesses all of the key concepts that we've been talking about so far. Through GPS, the app can monitor whether or not you're approaching a red box. He was approaching a place that he used to use. The app reaches out to engage him with an artificial interaction, an artificial serve and return. He's encouraged to interact with the app because of, the contingency management approach. An easy $10 if you actually respond, you're motivated to do that. And then the determination that he actually needed an in-person, real life serve and return interaction because his planes were potentially about to crash. His air traffic control system was offline. So his counselor stepped in to support him through that process. Okay, next slide. So now I want to share a couple of examples, idealized examples about how the massive red box that has dropped onto all of our resilience scales potentially influences people over time. Next slide. And so what we're going to talk about are 3 different examples, one for an individual who has high resilience, one for an individual who has medium resilience, one for an individual who has low resilience, and how all of these key systems interplay with each other to influence their resilience during the COVID pandemic. So the first example is a married woman with 2 children. She had a very good start in life, positive, solid childhood. She maintains a good relationship with her family. She's happily married. Her spouse is employed full-time. She works part-time. They have some savings. They own their home. She has a number of close friends. And she also regularly attends a gym to give herself an outlet, not just to improve her physical fitness, but to cope with her day-to-day stress. So all of these are green boxes that you can see piled on that right-hand side of her scale and weighing down the positive arm. She also has a couple of red boxes that are piled up on the left-hand side because, we all essentially have some red boxes in our lives. She suffers from seasonal depression, and she has an elderly mother with dementia who she's concerned about. But what you can see is that her fulcrum, that tipping point, those skills and abilities, is positioned a little bit over to the left-hand side. That's because she had a really good start in life. She has a lot of green boxes currently in her life. And so the blue needle that you see just at the top of the fulcrum is pointing in the positive outcome side. So she's currently experiencing a good outcome. So what happens when the pandemic hits? Next slide. Next slide. So what happens is she starts to lose some of the green boxes that were weighing down the positive arm on her scale, just as all of us have essentially lost some of the green boxes that are weighing down the right-hand side of our scale. So what happened to her? Well, of course, the schools closed, and so her kids are now at home. They're younger kids. They're trying to manage Zoom school, and she's trying to help them with this. Her retail store closed. She lost her job. While her spouse still works, they now potentially can see the potential for financial difficulties down the road. Her gym closed, so she has no physical outlet for her stress. And her mother is actually in a long-term care home, and she can't visit her on a regular basis, and so she's quite concerned. So what happens to her scale as she loses green boxes and the red boxes start to pile up? Next slide. What you can see is that her scale starts to tip a little bit more in the negative direction, but her blue needle still points to that green positive side. She still has a good outcome. She still has the foundational skills and abilities to be able to engage with the positive supports that she does have, despite the fact that she's lost a few of those. And again, with those strong supportive relationships that she has, she's been able to navigate through some of the additional adversity that she's experiencing. Okay, next slide. The next example is a young woman, university aged. She did not have quite the same early childhood as the first example did. But what you can see is she actually has a lot of green boxes piled up on the right-hand side of her scale. And her blue needle is pointing right now in the positive direction. So what does she have going for her? Well, she has a really good relationship with her father. She attends university, and while there, she lives with some close friends. In terms of extended family, she's best friends with her cousin. She achieves good grades at school. She plays intramural soccer. She has a job as a summer camp counselor. She's also been in recovery for 4 years from an eating disorder, and she attends Al-Anon meetings to support herself for her mother. And so what you can see on the left-hand side of her scale are a few more red boxes before the pandemic hits, because she did have a few challenges growing up. So first off, she has a mother who's in active alcohol addiction. She suffers from anxiety. Her parents divorced when she was in high school. Of course, she has, again, that history of disordered eating. And she's also a high social media user. And what you'll notice in terms of her fulcrum is it's positioned a little bit more in the center for her, because she has had a few challenges, more so than the first example early in life. She has fairly strong skills and abilities, potentially not as strong as the first example. But again, before the pandemic hits, she is doing well. Her blue needle points in the positive direction. So now what happens when the pandemic hits? Next slide. What you'll see is that she also starts to lose green boxes and accumulate red boxes. So what happens for her? Well, the university closes, all the classes go online. She has to move home, and even though she does have a good relationship with her dad, she misses the relationship with the close friends who she was living with. Her grades start to slip. Of course, all the intramural sports are canceled, so there's no soccer, no summer camps anymore, so she loses her job. She doesn't have any income. She does not like the online Al-Anon interaction, and so she stops attending her Al-Anon support meetings. And she ends up having really intense feelings of loneliness, because even though she was a high social media user before, all of her social interactions now have essentially migrated to online. So what happens to her scale as she loses green boxes and gains red boxes? Next slide. What you can see is that her scale tips more to the negative side. Now she has actually a very heavy burden on the left-hand side of that scale, and very few positive supports and experiences that are weighing down the right-hand side. And because she is still young, and because her skills and abilities were not that strong to begin with, what can happen over time is that those experiences, that adversity, can continue to erode her ability to strengthen those skills. And those start to slip, and her outcome starts to point in the negative direction. Again, her disordered eating reemerges. Okay, next slide. So the last example I'll share is an example of an older man who had a very different start in life compared to the other two examples. He was removed from his biological family as a child and was in and out of multiple foster homes over the course of his childhood. And what you can see is a lot of red boxes on the left-hand side and not very many green boxes on the right-hand side. So this individual, you will also notice the skills and abilities, that fulcrum of the scale has slid over to the right-hand side because he didn't have as good of a start in life. He didn't learn some of the coping skills and abilities that most kids get the opportunity to learn, to set him up to cope with the additional challenges that he faced. So what's going on in his life? Well, again, multiple foster homes as a child. He has had inconsistent employment over the course of his adult life. And that means that he goes through occasional bouts of homelessness and is sometimes in and out of temporary shelter. He has few inconsistent relationships in his life, a past conviction for petty theft. He has severe anxiety, low self-esteem. In terms of his physical health, he has diabetes. And in terms of his mental health, he actually does use opioids on occasion. But he also has some green boxes because we find that all of us all do. So he has a good relationship with a foster sister who he remains in contact with. He does have a few solid friends who he sees on a regular basis. He knows how to access the food bank when he's short on cash. And he's also able to get odd jobs for cash when he's going through periods of unemployment. So what you'll see, though, is that his blue needle does point in the negative direction. The left-hand side of his scale is very heavy. His skills and abilities are not very strong. And so he's struggling even before the pandemic hits. But what happens after the pandemic hits? Next slide. Next slide. So again, some of the few green boxes that he has starts to disappear. The odd jobs dry up. He now has no access to ready cash. He's unable to visit the food bank regularly to beef up his food supply when he needs it. There is limited shelter capacity because of the social distancing requirements due to the pandemic. And so he occasionally has to sleep rough on the street. One of his friends passes from COVID, and he starts to use opioids much more heavily than before. And he also now has challenges accessing his insulin because the primary care clinic that he was using has different hours, and he finds it difficult to get there. So again, what happens to his outcome now that the pandemic has hit? Next slide. What you'll see is that he tips even further over into the negative direction. And so that's how COVID has really been influencing all of our scales, whether we start with high, medium, or low resilience. We've all been affected. We've all lost some capacity for coping with challenge. Next slide. So today, the idea would be to explore how to use these concepts, either with individuals, with families, or for yourself. You can think about mapping, even for yourself, your own resilience scale by taking a piece of paper, drawing a line across it, and thinking about, what are the green boxes in my life? What are the red boxes in my life? How many do I have, and how do they pile up on either side of that scale? And you can start by thinking about the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. There's a questionnaire out there that you can think about. Did I experience any of those when I was a child? What about some of the experiences that I've had as an adult? Or if you're working with another individual, client, or a patient, what experiences have they had as an adult that have been particularly challenging for them? Perhaps it's a high conflict divorce. Perhaps they've been a victim of a crime. Perhaps they lost a job and went through a long period of unemployment. How do those red boxes stack up? And then think about, again, the right-hand side. All of us have green boxes that we can think about. So start off by thinking about childhood. Even if you had some adversity in childhood, did you have positive, supportive, stable relationships with anyone in your life? If not within your immediate family, maybe within your extended family, or maybe with a coach or a teacher or a neighborhood or a pastor, a neighbor or a pastor or something like that. Who made you feel special in childhood, if anyone did? What were the opportunities that you had to build skills? And then thinking about your adult life, what other kinds of positive supports do you now have around you? Do you have a positive, supportive relationship with a partner? Do you have a strong network of friends? Do you have places to go, safe, stable, supportive places to go where you can use those as an outlet for stress? So even if it's, you know, a nice park that you like to go and walk in, or the opportunity for physical activity, or even other kinds of meaningful activities like art or other sorts of creative pieces, a cultural connection or a spiritual connection that you engage with on a regular basis. And then think about your own fulcrum or the fulcrum of the individual that you're working with, those skills and abilities. How did your start in life, whether good or bad, influence your skills and abilities, and what do they look like today? Are you able to support reciprocal serve and return interactions? Can you provide that positive supportive interaction for somebody else? Can you receive it from somebody else? Are you able to plan, prioritize, and organize, even despite the adversity, to access some of those positive supports and positive environments, those green boxes, to help you with your own resilience? Then you would place that somewhere along that beam and have a conversation about it. Next slide. And actually, I already talked about this. Next slide. And so again, it's the application, next slide, of this particular model and concept. And so what PALEX has been doing over the sort of the recent months or a couple of years, I guess, since the pandemic started, is really exploring this as a universal tool to explain the dynamic role that adversity, positive supports, and skills and abilities play in building resilience, not just in childhood, but across the lifespan. And since everyone has their own resilience scale, and because it's dynamic, we have sort of higher capacity for resilience and lower capacity for resilience at various points in our lives. But it's non-stigmatizing because everyone has this. Next slide. And so lastly, what I want to do is show you just a few short clips that will explain how these concepts can be used by individuals, by families, and by communities to understand resilience. Next slide. Okay, and so this is now an example of individual resilience. Next slide. This is a woman who engaged with an organization called the Family Center in Edmonton, and she'll talk now about her experience learning about this information, what it's meant to her. Next slide.
I've actually have been aware of the Family Center for a very long time. I became a client and in contact with them when my daughter was having high behavioral needs in her school. So I've been 14 years sober. I didn't have parents growing up, like the streets raised me, right? And the gangs. Not having parents, you have no idea how to parent. Having Sarah come into my life was a blessing. She's taught me a lot about the brain and trauma parenting and stuff like that, and how my kids are reacting to my trauma. Like now my kids are doing like super amazing. They get up in time for school, they're excited for school. Like I've not had one behavioral issue from either kids in school this year. And I'm actually doing the Brain Story course as well. It's been like a huge impact for me, and like my family's way healthier. And I have way more awareness about how my brain works, and I know when I'm in trauma, like that trauma-induced, like fight or flight situation, and I'm able to stop myself and really think through it, and I can recognize it in my children as well. I think it's so important. I think everybody should have the training.
Next slide. And unfortunately, there is a music background that I think we're going to lose in all the rest of the videos. They were fine to begin with, but it's the audio that's important. So the next two short clips are really going to focus on the intergenerational impact of these experiences, both from a sort of a thinking back on your own life perspective in terms of what you went through, as well as a forward thinking about how it can influence your experience with your own children. Next slide. And so both of these clips are from counselors at the Fresh Start Recovery Center in Calgary. Next slide.
Typically with the addict or the alcoholic, there's so much carnage in the past, you don't know where to start. I started sniffing glue when I was 12 years old to hide from a very violent alcoholic family. That trauma not only created barriers for me, but there was trust issues with other people. There was relationship issues because of my upbringing. All of that stuff was all part of the addiction. I took the certification, as did everybody here at Fresh Start, and the biggest thing that stood out for me was the multi-generational, that I wasn't just a bad person and my dad wasn't. It's been handed down through generations. Being clean and being able to understand how my brain works, to create those new pathways now where I can actually live in the good part of it. And just in short 5 years, after 47 years of addiction, 5 short years now, I've created new pathways where I don't even think about the traumas anymore.
Okay, next slide. And again, another counselor from Fresh Start talking about his experience with this. Next slide.
My name's Ian Hipperson. I'm an addictions counselor at Fresh Start Recovery Center. For these men, some of the issues that come up during counseling is family relationships. They experience neglect, abuse, all different types of toxic stress growing up. My biological mother's an addict. My brother became the surrogate father. My brother's 5 years old at the time, and he took care of me and my sister for about 4 years. We would run away and we'd live on the streets for short periods of time. I started using around 16 years old. The Brain Story certification course has definitely impacted a very important life experience I'm about to have with the birth of my first child. I have that generational addiction, but I also have all those adverse childhood experiences, the toxic stress, and those other pieces that have definitely impacted my life. Intergenerational trauma is something I firmly believe in, but I also believe in intergenerational healing.
Okay, next slide. And the last two examples before we wrap up are just how communities have been using this information to think about how they can build community resilience. Next slide. So this clip is from Charlton Weaselhead from the Kainai School Board, of course, on the Blood Reserve. Next slide.
My Blackfoot name is Namawetsaskas, which means playing around, fooling around. My English name is Charlton Weaselhead. I'm currently the acting principal here at Kainai High School. We as First Nations, we have about 12,000 community members dealing with the intergenerational effects of residential schools. How can we benefit our kids by our staff members getting to understand what epigenetics means? Getting them to understand where our students are coming from and that toxic stress. What are they dealing with? Well, my parents both went to residential school. I went there for 2 years. And so when my parents came back, they took their opportunity to be parents to my brothers and sisters and myself. We didn't get that full understanding of what loving means, what a positive relationship means. It's very dear to my heart that how I see my kids today is where I was given that opportunity to be the father that I wanted to be. When I knew that that was the whole purpose of being a parent, that's what I needed to do to cherish and to positively and respectfully and teach my children certain things that they need to understand. I know getting this opportunity to be a part of the Brain Story certification is going to mean a lot to our teachers, but most importantly, our students. Our students are coming to school where, 7 to 12 people are living in one home. They might be sleeping on the floor. They are coming to school, and this lunch that they're getting free is their only meal of the day. They're coming to school, and this is the only safe place that they have. They're dealing with some anxiety issues when they're leaving our school because some of them don't know what they're going into. We're going to get an idea of what trauma in the brain really is so that way our teachers can get a better understanding of what our students are dealing with on a daily basis.
Okay, next slide. And so to build on the work of the Kainai School Board, a few years ago, I believe it was in 2018, the community on the Blood Reserve wanted to create an intervention, a way for the youth to really feed back to the community at large about what their experience was, on the day-to-day, in their day-to-day lives, so that the community could hear from them and think about how best to move forward. So they organized a week-long conference that they called the Niitsitapi Resiliency Week. And what they did is over 2 days, they bussed in all the grade 9 and 10 students and got them working with creative people, music therapists, art therapists, all sorts of people who could help them articulate in a non-threatening and a non-exploitative way, and in a creative way, about what their experience daily was with the traumas that they were facing. And then they were going to share that on Wednesday morning and have time to plan around how to respond to those youth. But of course, the weekend before, there's a crisis hit the community. Of course, there is a crisis that hits that community pretty much all the time, but there were 65 overdoses across the community that weekend. But the organizers really wanted to ensure that they could move forward with this event, seeing it as kind of like a green box. We got yet another giant red box that's dropping on us. We actually need to be able to provide these interventions and these supports for everyone in the community. So they went ahead and had 2 days of planning on how to move forward with building community resilience based on the science. Next slide. Okay, and this is the last video. This is a short video explaining how a jurisdiction in the UK, Blackpool, has launched on a 10-year funded initiative to fundamentally change outcomes in Blackpool, and it's grounded in this science of resilience, and I'll let them explain about that a little bit more. Next slide.
When we brought Better Start to Blackpool, we started working with experts from across the world. And one group of experts we work with was the Palix Foundation in Alberta in Canada. So when they brought their brain story to us, it resonated very strongly with our local community and with the professional services across the public sector here. So we've been using that evidence to embed within our own approach.
My name is Meryl Davis and I'm the Director of the Centre for Early Child Development. The centre is the engine room of A Better Start in Blackpool, and we actually work with all of our partners to deliver early child development and outcomes. The science tells us that if we start really early in a child's life, so from the minute they're conceived, we can actually make a huge difference to their future.
Blackpool as an area is extremely deprived. If you look on the national scale, 8 of the top 10 wards in the country for deprivation are located within Blackpool. Then the Palix Foundation came to Blackpool and we listened to what they had to say, and from that moment in time we decided we were going to educate our officers around what exactly that meant.
My name is Alan Stein. I am Professor of Child and Adolescent.
Early on in our child's lives and how that can be instrumental as the child gets older, and the more support they have, the longer, stronger of that support they've got throughout within the community and the parents as a whole, the better start they have.
Feedback overall was how important it was that we all take responsibility for building children's brains. It's not just mum and dad, it's the wider community, and we've all got a role in doing that.
My name is Elizabeth Rapper and I'm a researcher at the University of Oxford, where I work in the Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Group. What's really been great in the last few days here is seeing all the success that the Brain Story has had in Alberta, and then seeing it firsthand here in Blackpool, that the Brain Story as a tool is completely transferable, and the success of it is regardless of context, regardless of environment, regardless of country.
We can use the story of the developing brain and utilise the evidence that they've generated over there, but take those ideas and take those concepts and work with local parents, local families, and think about how we integrate all of that learning into our local community.
Since we started this work, antisocial behaviour has dropped dramatically. Across the town, we've seen the biggest reductions in the last calendar year that we've had for years.
We believe that this should be able to work absolutely anywhere in the UK. If we can do this in Blackpool, then it is absolutely doable anywhere.
Great, next slide. And this is the last slide, by the way. And so the PALEX Foundation is continuing to work with their partners and with individuals and organizations on the ground to explore how the resilience scale can be used potentially as a clinical practice tool, potentially as a tool that can help guide measurement of individual outcomes over time, as a conceptual framework for providing a common understanding across systems, as well as a tool that can help people understand and support a more seamless continuum of care. And with that, I will stop that presentation, and I know Nancy is here on the call as well to answer any questions or field any comments that people have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sharon, for that presentation. That was excellent, and I was excited to see the 197 people that did sign in on this morning's presentation. So that was very nice to see. Do any members of council have any questions at all? Seeing none, I do have a motion here. Be it resolved that the Community Safety Standing Policy Committee receive the presentation for information. Could I get a mover, please? Councillor Middleton Hope. All in favor? That's passed. Thank you both very much, and thank you for everybody in attendance for this presentation today. Next up on the agenda, we have Clean and Safe Committee updates and recommendations. We have, it's a submission here. Yep, I just wanted to pull it up. I have a request here actually for a brief 5-minute break, so if everybody who is here for that presentation is okay with that? Okay, we're going to take just a brief 5-minute break. Thank you. All right, everyone, we'll call the meeting back to order. Thank you very much for bearing with us and your patience for that brief break. We are on to item 6.1, submissions from Cindy Voss and Jason Doberstein, the Clean and Safe Group, co-chairs, re the Clean and Safe Committee updates and recommendations. I trust that members of the committee have had an opportunity to take a look through the submission. Does anybody have any questions for either of the submitters regarding the submission? Since I don't see anyone or any from anybody yet. All right, I do have a couple of questions for the submitters, whoever would like to speak to them. So you are asking, all three mics work.
Good, thank you.
So we are asking, you do have your summary here, that you voted to pursue the 5 following initiative recommendations: the public washroom audit, the safety and security strategy, resource hub, public awareness campaign, and youth engagement strategy, but there was no information submitted for what those exactly were, and particularly for those of us who are new to council. Could you maybe just give a brief summary on what those are so that we can understand a little bit better?
I'm going to ask Michael Boep in a moment to talk about the public washroom strategy, safety and security strategy. I can talk some about the youth engagement strategy, and that's a large project involved with essentially the police service has completely changed what used to be formerly known as our school resource officers. We reevaluated that unit, working with the community and the Clean and Safe group. That is now the youth engagement unit, and the whole focus of that unit is diverting youth from the criminal justice system and getting them connected with the right resources and on the right path. So a year from now or 2 years from now, they're not on the streets of Lethbridge. There's a lot to that. One of the things is we've contracted a company called Help Seeker that has been interviewing youth, at-risk youth in the community that are dealing with the criminal justice system and have challenges in their home. What we can do to support them. And in addition to that, one of the things we need to do is probably add, and the next layer is we need to add a social worker to the program. And we also need to add a youth solution group where we bring those youth involved, led by an employee, likely somewhere across the city organization would help lead that group of youth to continue to develop programs within the community that keep youth on the right path. One of the things is we want to do with the program is that when we first started it, one of the things I said was we need to get to a point where we know exactly who to connect that youth to make sure that they head down the right path and they get the proper resources. And that's probably been one of the biggest mistakes, in fact, that there's people all over the place that'll refer you to the next program. And what we actually want to do with this program is develop a platform where we have the right resources in place, where we're going to be right there to provide as many resources as we can with all our connections across the community. So we're in the development stage of this whole program. There's a lot of work yet to do. The second piece probably that I'm largely involved in is our media campaign that involves, you may have seen through some of our social media, the police service, we've done one program called Stop the Op, and there's some comics and what have you. But first off, targeted at supporting community and understanding a lot of our crime in the community. In fact, our crime severity index in our community that puts us on the headlines of Maclean's page is actually from break-and-enters, mischief and theft, and fraud. So a lot of those are things that people within the community can do things themselves to prevent that crime from occurring or help us so it doesn't happen. So a lot of that campaign was focused on educating the public. Now we're to the stage of that where we're starting to focus with offenders. There'll be some hard copy ads, maybe some posters, some bus station advertising focused on the offenders, how we connect them with the right resources so they don't head down that path. And there's a whole bunch of suggestions as our work with help seekers where we could go. And I think the next step is Clean and Safe group, and probably Cindy and I will meet with the city and decide, okay, are we adopting all these? Or are we going to move forward with 2 or 3 of these next? There's a lot of work yet to be done in that as well. Michael, you
Yes, and in terms of the washroom, public washroom strategy, the CDWS team was tasked by the Clean and Safe Committee to present some best case scenarios and a proposal for the public washroom strategy, as well as the safe and security strategy, which we did at the last meeting in December. From that, this Clean and Safe Committee recommended that we put forward $5,000 towards a public washroom audit. So the CDWS team is currently in the process of doing that, as well as in the procurement stages for a safety and security strategy that we'll be putting out. Many of those details and those proposals will be upcoming at the next SPC meeting with the CWS administrative update.
Thank you very much. I'm wondering if sometime over the next couple of days, a submission could be sent in to the city clerk's office so we could have that added to our agenda package for next Tuesday, just to go in addition with this so the rest of council understands what's going on as well. Is that possible? So just something that briefly outlines which all 5 are and what's going on. Just a small, it doesn't have to be a ton of information, just sort of a brief summary of each, just so that the rest of council can understand.
Betcha, yeah, we can do that.
Perfect. Do any other members of council have any questions at all? Seeing none, I do have a motion here in front of me. Be it resolved that the Community Safety Standing Policy Committee receive the Clean and Safe Committee update for information. Could I have a mover, please? Mark, second by John, Councillor Middleton-Home. All in favor? That's carried. Thank you very much. Our next submission is from Chief Adair, Fire EMS, Lethbridge Fire and Emergency Services operational needs. I trust everybody has had an opportunity to read those materials. We do have a motion in front of us. And I'm just wondering if anybody has any questions of Chief Adair before we take a look at that motion. No, there's no presentation, it's a submission. The presentation was in the package.
Is this the appropriate forum in terms of requesting additional funding for the 2023-2026 budget?
So yeah, we would take a look at this and we take a look at the motion and then we do, we vote on it and then we make that recommendation to council and the rest of that and the information then goes to council to vote on it.
Perhaps then a question to Chief Adair. So what data is this predicated on? You're requesting for 8 additional firefighters / paramedics. What's this predicated on? What's the need based on?
Sure, thank you for that question. About a year ago, we started to do some review with regards to our response times and how we could make sure that we had an effective response force from a fire perspective, respond to our events throughout the years. So what we have seen and I guess if we were to back up from there, we have an EMS contract that allows us to use our EMS resources to aid in fire suppression. Now that contract was first, I guess, created in 2009 and then reviewed again in 2014. Since that time, we've seen a significant increase in EMS call volumes. In fact, the last year we've seen an increase of over 2,000 calls, which is a 14% increase in itself. From there, we've seen a number of calls where our ambulances are heading outside of the city and not available to aid in the fire response. So with that information, we came back to council last year and said to ensure that we had an effective response force to be able to respond to fire events within the city, we needed to look at increasing our fire manning from a 3-person fire apparatus to a 4-person fire apparatus. because previously we were using a 3-person fire truck, we were adding a 2-person ambulance to create a 5-person fire response for that effective fire response number. But because the ambulances are not available like they were previously, we needed to come up with a new model and a new strategy to ensure we had that fire response. So last year we went to council and we started with 9 individuals because we believe we need 30 individuals to create that effective response force. And that would be by providing 4-person fire engines at each of the 5 stations, which currently we have 3 at. So last year we started with 9 individuals. This year we were looking to add 8 into that fold, which would again increase that 3-person fire apparatus to 4-person fire apparatus. And then we would look at a strategy going forward on how we could get those remaining individuals to ensure we had that effective fire response force.
Thank you for that, Chief. Having spoken with your union in regards to this particular need, I'm familiar with the implications for it. Couple of questions then. So this is a direct pressure predicated on the fact that AHS's communications model now requires, or has required for some time now, when your paramedics / firefighters are outside of the city doing a transport, for example, to Calgary, they are available for and are frequently deployed to additional situations along the way. So they do a transport to Calgary, which is quite frequent. They'll come down, or they'll drop off a patient at, of course, I didn't get dropped off. I was actually taken very good care of when I was taken to the Foothills Hospital. But on the way back, I was informed by the firefighter, or the paramedics rather, that they're responsive to calls all the way down. And effectively, whether it's a 10-hour shift or a 12-hour shift, they're lost to the city of Lethbridge. So that's a significant concern, and I certainly am sympathetic to the need for additional firefighters. How does that play out if AHS makes some decisions going forward that will reduce our, reduce the impact on our fire services in terms of the demand for providing for firefighters, or for paramedics rather, then becomes a provincial responsibility? How does that impact this request?
Yeah, for sure. When we created or partnered with Alberta Health Services and created our EMS contract back in the time, it was a very innovative contract, and it allowed the EMS resources to be used to aid in fire suppression. But since that time, there's been a number of changes with the AHS EMS contract and the management. And when we entered this contract, we would have never done a call in Calgary. We would have rarely done a call outside of the city of Lethbridge. We would have never been asked to go and sit in Pincher Creek or somewhere else for medical coverage. These are all new conundrums we're facing today. So we do recognize that asking for these additional resources also is tied very heavily to our EMS contract. And that's part of this, bullet point number 2. When we sit at the table with negotiations with Alberta Health Services in the coming, we're hoping, months, because our contract is set to expire March of 23, that we can actually address some of these concerns and look for some financial compensation to adjust our contract to ensure that our EMS resources can be dedicated to the EMS world, where all fire resources can be dedicated to the fire world. In our previous contract, we had a partnership where we could jointly use them, but all the risk now falls on us because AHS call volumes increase. We're responding outside of the city. So we're trying to look at this as a holistic piece, and that's why we tied in the hiring of these individuals to the EMS contract going forward, because we know that we need to come back to the city with a financially responsible EMS contract which will help offset these costs on the fire side of the business.
So the decisions that are being made provincially affect us from a municipal perspective financially. So, assuming that over the course, because this is what you're asking for here, this is just for 2022, correct?
That's correct.
Are you coming forward with an additional request for 23 to 26?
Yes, that will be an additional 13 individuals to make that complement of 30 firefighters.
This is a pretty complex question, Madam Chair, and I'm not sure that this is again, I'm not sure this is the appropriate venue for it. By agreeing to this motion, this goes then, I presume, Mr. City Clerk, this goes to City Council for discussion of the whole?
Yes, it does.
Okay, so by approving this motion, then we're not approving. Obviously, we're not approving any funding, but we're in principle approving the fire chief's submission in regards to this particular component.
Well, part of the motion is to recommend the funding for 2022, which would then be put into the base budget for the next operating 4-year cycle. We do have the city treasurer online in case you have any questions relating to that.
Yeah, I think so. There's Mr. Matthews.
Good afternoon. Yes, that is correct, what Mr. Sarsfield had mentioned. The way this resolution is reading right now, it has one-time funding that's being used for 2022 that will actually be allowed to hire the staff. And if approved, it will be put into the base budget for these 8 staff members as a budget pressure. So it would be similar to how council approves the CIP, and then the council, when council approves the CIP, there's operating costs and they automatically become base budget pressure. So it's a little bit different than what we normally have in regards to initiatives coming through in the fall of this year for the rest of, the rest of 13 that Mr. Chief Adair mentioned. In this case here, just because of the nature and timing, it's looked like we're going to need to do this in this order to be able to actually continue with business continuity.
So this is a question. Mark, do you want to jump in? I still got additional questions.
Continue on. My question is unrelated to what you're dealing with here. So okay, just continue.
So, just so that I'm clear, you're looking at an increase of authorized strength of 21 people, and is that front end loaded?
So the overall approach is we were looking for 30 individuals. 9 were added last year. This year would add an additional 8. And then from there, we would be looking for 13 individuals over the coming years. And we would be coming back to council for approval for that piece. So this request is for adding 8 additional employees at this time. A staggered approach for that total of 30 individuals.
So 30 over the next 4 years, 8 now, but a total of 30 over the next 4 years?
9 was hired last year, so they're already in this total of 30. So it would be an additional of 8 this year and 13 next year.
Yeah, and these are increases to your authorized strength?
Yes.
Okay, I'll let Mark go ahead.
Councillor Campbell?
Thank you. Just and one of the things you want is to continue to pursue the reversal of the dispatch transition, and I'm just wondering, you probably don't have anything to add to it, but is there a temperature in the room about this going anywhere beyond what already has been said? No. Do you have any optimism?
I would suggest we have a little more optimism than we've had in the past year. We were working with the previous Deputy Health Minister, and we've moved into a relationship with a new Deputy Health Minister. And the temperature seems to have changed somewhat, where it seems to be more collaborative. And we do have some optimism there. We are still meeting on a regular basis. They are looking to do a provincial analysis on the whole system, EMS and dispatch. And we have Ourselves and other integrated fire services are there at the tables during those discussions, which is a change, a positive change for us. So yes, there is some optimism at this time that we have laid out to Alberta Health Services, and we said, look, there's some significant reductions in service. We need those rectified. We could do that tomorrow if we brought the dispatch service back into our center, because really it's about removing those that level of service decrease that we're after, and ultimately we know we can do that tomorrow. So we will continue to have those discussions with Alberta Health Services.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Campbell. Councillor Middleton Hope, did you have some more questions?
Yeah. Mr. Matthews, what's the tax implications for this?
I'd have to take a quick look here, but for every 1.6, roughly about 1.58 to 1.6 million dollars is a 1%. So this would be roughly 0.5% tax increase.
Right, and Chief, this represents what, about a 20 to 24% increase in your authorized strength overall?
We're at 168 individuals now, as it sits today, and we're looking for an additional 30.
I'm dumbfounded, quite honestly. It's a significant increase. And I look at other areas of the corporation that have been adversely impacted by city council decisions, and I look at where funding has gone and so forth. This is a significant ask. Mr. Matthews, other than through direct taxation, do we have funding currently available that would provide for the positions that the chief is currently asking for?
To Councillor Middleton Hope, no. So this would be typically, well, barring any sort of negotiation piece with AHS coming in 2023. So any increase on that. Other than that, in this regard here, it would be taxation would be the funding source.
Okay, thank you.
So a question sort of following up on that for Chief Adair. With the increase of the 8 firefighters, and we're using the BAU for this year, and then it moves into the operating budget, is that going to help us leverage the contract negotiations with AHS right now? Because we do supplement that with our fire and EMS. So will that help us with our contract negotiations with AHS?
Yeah, we've already entered that discussion with AHS. When they looked at taking the dispatch center out of Lethbridge, we started having those discussions saying there are impacts with every one of your actions, and this was part of it. We had, and we've been in discussions with them previous to that, saying your system status management, or the way you're actually using our resources, when we entered into an agreement with you back in the day, we entered into it as a partnership. And in that partnership came a reduced cost to Alberta Health Services because we were able to use the ambulances to aid in fire suppression. So with the changes you've implemented, Alberta Health Services, we are going to have to come back to the table asking for an increased funding source from you. I can speak in generalities. I know our funding that we receive from Alberta Health Services is less than, significantly less than other integrateds around the province because of the model we had. So as we're transitioning away from this model, we will be seeking additional funding from them. So they are aware these discussions will be going on, and we will be coming to the table with an increased ask.
And how optimistic are you that we might get that increased ask?
Well, we actually have an advocacy group working with Alberta Health Services on these very questions and concerns. So we're certainly trying to do our part. But if we could just put everybody on an equal playing field, I'm optimistic that there will be, there will be an opportunity to increase our funding going forward. We also know that our contract, our compensation for our contract was last made in 2014. We know there's an inflationary amount of money that we have to come back to the table. And we're going to be asking in the millions of dollars going forward. And when we talk about bullet number 2, looking for a long-term contract that makes financial sense, it has to make financial sense from our standpoint. And that's, we'll be asking for significantly more dollars, in the neighborhood of $3 million or more going forward.
Thank you. Councillor Middleton Hope.
So this probably is to Mr. Matthews. So the chief is talking about funding this through a BAU account. Do they have the money in the BAU account?
Yes, they do. They have those.
You guess they do? Is that a yes, they do, or?
Sorry, yes, they do have the funds available inside the BAU account.
I mean, this pays for a one-time initiative. This doesn't pay for the costs of these personnel going forward. So this is an additional cost that's going to be added into your budget request. So when you're talking about $3 or $4 million increase, you're talking about were council to approve all 30 personnel. Wow. Okay.
Anybody have any other questions? I've got one last question here. Okay. The one question I have is that if we don't approve this now to set up, what will we be losing out on with these 8 additional firefighters? Like, we're going to miss the training opportunity in the fall, I believe. Anything else in delaying this decision?
Yeah, because of the hiring process, it's such a lengthy process. If we can't move forward with this today, we will lose that opportunity to hire them and train them in the fall, because of course fire training doesn't go very well in the winter months. So that would be the goal, is to get them in this year. The other piece that we're just investigating is, in Ontario, there's a ruling out that has gone forward, and it talks about an effective fire response force. And some of the services in Ontario were actually had 2 or 3 person fire engines. The ruling that we're reading about and trying to learn more about speaks about that is not a safe response force. So as our business has changed and we're unable to attach that 2-person ambulance to aid in that 3-person fire apparatus response, we believe we're at risk at not meeting those needs. So we continue to look at the rulings that are coming from Ontario, but further than that, we just know that an effective response force of 3 on a fire engine, there's a significant risk of safety.
Have any other questions for Member Middleton Hope?
So what's the impact if this doesn't get approved?
Impact is we will have a lack of an effective response force. We won't have the number of individuals at a fire scene to effectively or safely respond to structural fires, high-rise fires, grass fires within the city.
Which is the condition that you're in now.
Correct.
Are there any other options besides either approving this or not approving it?
Yes, I'm going to ask City Clerk Sarsfield to explain that. We were just talking about that.
So right now, what the recommendation, or one of the possible recommendations would be, is to council would be approve the funding for 2022 for these 8 officers, and the rest would be considered as part of the next operating budget cycle, or alternatively not. One other option would be defer the discussion until the budget deliberations of council, which would occur in November, which in effect would mean it wouldn't take place this year. Just depends on the flavor.
I think, Madam Chair, what my concern is that we're presented with a motion here with almost no information in regards to how we arrived at these numbers. Chief, you've provided us with a brief overview, and in fairness, I would love to give you a greater opportunity to present to us a more fulsome request, because at this particular point in time, I'm looking at this and I'm saying, well, unfortunately, this doesn't make a lot of sense to me right now, and I need to have more information, and I would love to be able to give you the opportunity to come back to us in a very short period of time, if that's possible, to be able to give us some additional information.
So we can ask the chief to come back and do a presentation at the next safety. We can defer this motion and ask the chief to come back and do a presentation at the next safety SPC if we would like to do that.
What is that, Mr. Sarsfield? And I think at that opportunity as well, we would encourage our colleagues to, although they are not part of the voting group here, it would give them an opportunity to come online and listen to your presentation. And I think that would give, beyond me anyway, I think it would give people a greater sense of understanding and perhaps a comfort level that I currently don't possess. Okay?
So our next meeting would be March 10th.
How does that work? Chief?
Yeah, that works for us for sure.
That would work, and if we defer this motion until then, that doesn't hinder your hiring process or influence what we're looking, like it doesn't stop you from still carrying on with your negotiations and everything like that with Alberta Health Services. That's still going to happen.
Yeah, we'll continue on with that as we speak.
Okay. Does the rest of the committee feel like so we would be changing this motion then to defer
decision and request additional information.
Mark, do you feel that, or do you have any thoughts around that?
I'm just thinking, is it appropriate to make the presentation at our next council meeting so that everyone is there and we can actually make a decision at council, or is that not enough time?
It would be better to be done at the committee level, because then you could have a really thorough discussion.
Okay.
Because at council, you are limited for time-wise.
Okay. If that's good with the chief, then that's good with me.
Councillor Middleton Hope, that's satisfactory to you? Yep. Chief Adair, that would be satisfactory to you?
Yep, that would work.
Okay. So we're getting a new motion up there on the board. I can't twist like that. Be it resolved that, so we're adding to the motion, be it resolved that the Community Safety Standing Policy Committee defer this item to the March 10th, 2022 meeting of the Community Safety Standing Policy Committee. Could I please have a mover for that? Councillor Middleton Hope, all in favor? All right, that will be deferred to then. Seeing no other items on the agenda, that's adjournment. Thank you very much for everybody coming out, and thank you everybody for their time.
Thank you.
Thank you.